get going on the topic of the day, which, as y'all know, is a deep dive into the wonderful world of property values and tax rates. Very exciting stuff. Hopefully it's at least timely if it's not the most exciting stuff. And so you guys have, in Region 1, have seen various versions of this and pieces over the years as I've tried to sort of, help y'all understand how the local property value survey works, what the PVS results are, or the PVS reports are from the controller's office, how that impacts your funding. So we're going to really go through all of that and a lot of nitty gritty. I do want this session to work more like a workshop than like a lecture. I think Romalda very ambitiously booked us for a 3-hour session today. So if it's just me and Amy talking this whole time, I think we'll be exhausted by the end. So please put questions in the chat. If it's okay with Romalda, we'll let you come off mute and ask questions. But we want this to be interactive and useful for y'all. And so please, let's feel free to interrupt and let's make this more of a workshop again than a lecture. Okay, so as y'all know, property values are very important to determining your funding under the state school finance system. But different versions of your property values are used for different purposes. And there's not really a source at the CAD usually to explain this. Usually they don't know school finance. They know how to appraise value and sort of the property tax, but they don't necessarily always speak school finance. And so you kind of have to bring your knowledge to those CAD reports and interpret them correctly so that you can do an accurate revenue projection. And there's really, as I list here, there's 3 main ways that property values are used in sort of the post HB3 world. Of course, now with House Bill 3, property values determine your tax rate. They have a role in determining your tax compression. And that's the section that Amy is going to dive into here. And that Romalda mentioned earlier, that you get your certified reports, and then you have to send that information over the TEA and a local property value survey. That then drives your tier 1 rate compression. Property values are also used, your local property values are also used to determine the state values. Your CAD submits that to the controller's office. The controller's office does some calculations and looks at certain bits of information and then calculates the state certified property values. Those, of course, then get folded into the school finance system to determine your local share and to determine your state aid. Or your recapture amount if you're a Chapter 49 district. And as I note there's some nuances, right? There's for the state certified values, they don't recognize a local optional homestead exemption. And they treat frozen values a little bit differently than your local CADs. And so that's, again, a slightly different set of numbers that you need from this same CAD report to help you determine what your T2 might be once those get released the following January. And then, of course, property values are what you, when you adopt your tax rate, that's what you levy against. And so they play a role in determining your tax collections. I think most CFOs across the state have a pretty good handle on how to sort of look at a CAD report and figure out what their tax levy and their tax collections might be for the next year. But we'll go ahead and just walk through that at the very end. We're saving the easiest thing for the last. So hopefully that'll be where you guys are most fatigued after all of the other discussion. And so hopefully that structure makes sense for y'all. And so with that, I'm going to toss it over to Amy. She's going to start with this first bullet point on how property values are used for tax compression.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So as Romalda mentioned earlier, the LPVS just opened last week on the 18th. It's going to close on August 1st. That's a Monday this year. Value growth is determined by the data that TA collects through the local property value survey, which we often refer to as the LPVS. In this data collection, school districts are required to interpret their CAD reports and then submit that information on the LPVS. And after that, TA will approve it. And if a district has any changes, they usually have until, or they will have until August 11th to appeal. TA will then process those appeals and finalize the final MCRs on August 31st. And now they will get incorporated into the SOF the following February when preliminary property values are also incorporated. So what do districts report on the LPVS? For the previous year, TA is looking for your July 25th certified taxable values, which you'll get from your CAD, and the local optional homestead exemption loss, if your district has it. Only about 1/3 of districts across the state have a LOHI, so it's more than likely that your district does not, but we can always help you verify this information that you'll get on your CAD report. For the current year, TA is also looking for your July 25th certified taxable values. They're looking for any expiring Chapter 313 or 311 limitations for that, only for that year, if your district has one. And again, TA is also looking for your LOHI if your district has one. So here is this is what the survey looks like, the local property value survey. We have some items that TA will pre-populate from the previous year. This is the first line. This is the tax year 2021 LOHI. This is, oh.
Sorry.
Yes, so this is, oh, okay. This is pulled, I think we're good now. This is pulled from your previous year survey. And also, let's see, line 3, which is the tax, hey, thanks, Josh, for the tax year 2021 certified values. That will be also pulled from your previous year LPVS submission. And another big note is when your district is entering in these July 25th certified values, they're or for 21, do not update it with any supplements. Like TA just wants to compare the July 25th value to the July 25th value. Okay, another pre-populated bit is pre-populated from the comptroller's preliminary property values study. This is the T2 value for the prior tax year. You can edit this field, but you really only should if your district has received an approved protest from the comptroller. Otherwise, you can just leave it as is.
And just to chime in, you will know if you have a protest report. You will work, Mokasi, we do protests and audits. Other tax firms out there will support you on this work, and they should be communicating with you that you have a successfully completed audit, and that you'll get a series of reports from the controller's office with that new T2. And so if you did want to update that would be where you would pull that value from, that report that you get from the firm, essentially, that is helping you file that protest. And then I guess just one thing here real quick. Even if you do have a protest, it's not going to impact anything on your MCR calculation unless you have a local optional homestead exemption. Because the way this calculation works is it's just a percentage applied to your prior year value. Again, it's only going to change that MCR if you have a local optional homestead exemption. In this case with Zapata, they do, and so if they did have a protest, they would want to update this. And I want to say thanks to our friends in Zapata for offering to be a guinea pig for this presentation. You know, whenever Romalda sends out those emails, volunteer to be a guinea pig, because then we'll do all the work for you during the presentation, and you'll have your stuff all done. Okay, Amy, back to you.
I think we skipped a slide.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Yes. Okay. So for this year, for tax year 2022, you want to enter the value, the July 25th value from your totals report from the CAD. So what does this July 25th value consist of? TA is looking for the grand totals page, the net taxable value from that page, and if that is split up into an M&O or INS, TA is looking for the M&O side. So we want to make sure that we're not using the ARB approved page. This only includes values that it doesn't include all the values that are under protest, whereas the grand totals does. For freeze adjusted, we don't want to use that because it doesn't include any value loss from any value loss from those frozen properties. And again, the tier 1 rate is for your M&O, for M&O purposes. So we're going to look at M&O and not INS. Okay, this is an example for Zapata ISD. So you're going to enter the M&O net taxable value from the grand totals page into the LPVS. If you have, so if you have a 313 agreement in place, that's where you'll see the separate M&O and INS. If you don't have that, you'll just see this net taxable figure right here. And this is what you will enter into the LPVS from the grand totals page. So just a reminder, there are 3 things we're looking for when you're entering this value into the LPVS, the July 25th certified value. You're going to make sure it says certified values, certified totals at the top. And it sounds like for Hidalgo County, that'll come out Monday or Tuesday. So great timing. Make sure it has the grand totals subheading underneath. And then you're looking for the net taxable value right here. Okay, so this is where you will enter, again, this is where you'll enter that value into the LPVS for tax year 2022. And we're going to skip over chapter 311 and 313 limitation expirations for now. Josh will touch on that a little bit later. For the local optional homestead exemption for tax year 22, you will enter this value from the certified totals report from your CAD. And remember that the local optional homestead exemption is not the same as the state mandated 40,000 state homestead exemption. TA is only looking for the local optional homestead exemption. And you can find this usually on the second page of your certified totals, grand totals subheader page, you kind of look down at the bottom under, well, on the left side towards the bottom where it says HS, move over and look at the local column. This is going to be your LOHE amount. If you don't have anything here, if it's a 0, make sure it's also a 0 in your LPVS. And this again is where you'll enter it. So it looks like Josh pulled that in.
Ignore my typo here with decimals instead of commas. Sorry, I was putting this together too late last night. And the real quick note about the 313 and 311s. Again, as I note here, this only applies to those that had an active limitation in 21 and then that expired at the end of 21. So that's a very small subset of districts. So even if you have a 313, this may not even apply to you. And it's only going to apply to if you have had a 313 and it's expired at the end of the prior year. And so TA has that template that's out there, that MCR and tax rate template. We can share the link, Amy, if you wouldn't mind grabbing that here in a moment, or I can grab it here in a moment. We can put it in the chat. But they've sort of preloaded that data in there. So if it does apply to you, it'll show up in that tool. We've worked with a number of districts and confirmed that TEA is pulling the right data in the latest version of the tool. So you may want to, if you think this applies to you, you may want to go re-download that tool because there were some mistakes initially. So long story short, if you think all those caveats apply to you, give me a call and we'll talk offline about it. But again, it's going to maybe impact, 1 or 2 districts on the call today. So. Amy, do you want to go ahead and finish up on LPVS?
So important note, don't forget this, if your district is spread across multiple counties, you will need to just add the values for all the counties within the boundaries and then put them together for your LPVS entry. Okay, so in this example, after all the information has been entered into the LPVS, we can see that the district's local preliminary MCR is compressed down to 0.7967. But because there is a 90% floor that limits tax year 2022 compression to 0.046, that will be the compression that the district receives. And that will be their maximum compressed tax rate, your preliminary MCR, in other words.
All right, so that was LPVS in a nutshell. We'll pause for a moment. Feel free to put questions in the chat if you guys are unclear about anything that we just went through. All right, I see one come in. So Web Consolidated had a 313 that expired in 21. Okay, so shoot me an email and let's have a Zoom later on this afternoon, and I can help you identify that the correct value to put in on the local property value survey. Again, I think TEA has pulled that information into the tax rate and MCR tool that Amy linked to earlier. So once you enter in your county district number on that, TEA should be pulling up the right number, but we've caught a couple of mistakes that the that getting that data right requires coordination between TEA and the controller's office, and sometimes the data can kind of get mixed up between the two. And so again, just shoot us an email and we can verify on the controller side that that TEA is pulled in the right data point there. Let's see. And feel free to send questions to the group so everyone can see them, but a couple of questions that came to me. Oh, yeah, so just some housekeeping. We probably should have done that at the beginning. The presentation will be recorded. Romalda is going to post that, I believe, to the Rejoin website, and she will also send out the PowerPoint as well. And we can share that out on our website as well. Let's see. Yeah, okay. And so then, yeah, if you don't have a 313, then none of this applies to you. But again, just only if you have one that expired in tax year 21. Okay. So now, if there's no more questions about LPVS and how your compression is going to work, then we'll move on. We kind of started with the micro, and then we're going to zoom out a little bit and talk about this thing from like a policy, a statewide policy perspective, sort of remind ourselves how we got here, and sort of all the different component parts of tax compression and how they get fed in together to arrive at our MCR. So again, we kind of just went through the data entry, how specifically what you need to get through your day, right? So we can check that box off, but I kind of want to give you all a little bit more context so you understand the why a little bit. So a quick little vocab lesson here, just to make sure that, I think Romalda did mention there's a number of new CFOs on the call, so just to make sure we're kind of all speaking the same language. Obviously, school districts have to adopt a maintenance and operation property tax rate to raise local funds. There's different components of this tax rate. There's 2 tiers, and then within the second tier, there's 2 levels, okay? All of this property tax compression stuff that we just talked about, that's going to impact tier 1, okay? This is the portion of the tax rate that's subject to that ongoing compression each year that House Bill 3 put in place, okay? Prior to House Bill 3, which passed in 2019, most districts had a tier 1 rate of $1, okay? And so then since 2019, since the passage of House Bill 3, that dollar has been compressed bit by bit, and the amount that it's been compressed varies depending on how fast your property values have grown since then. And you can see there's really 2 factors that go into the amount of compression you see. There's a statewide compressed amount. You can kind of view this as the ceiling for your tier 1 rate, and then there's your local property value growth. Again, if you're growing faster than the statewide averages, you're going to see additional property value growth, and you're going to be below that statewide ceiling. As we just went through, all of this stuff gets calculated on the local property value survey, and that's the sort of official application to determine your tier 1 rate each summer. And so here's kind of how, at a high level, how the statewide compression and the local compression work. And we're going to get into some specifics here in a minute, but I just want to kind of give you a little bit more context. So on the statewide compression side, this is going to be driven primarily from the statewide value growth estimate that the Controller's Office produces each October of an even year. So prior to the legislative session, October before the session, the Controller comes out with this with this forecast, and that is what gets plugged in initially to the statewide compression calculation. And the Controller can update this throughout the session, but this is sort of a Controller generated number. And again, what they're trying to project is the statewide value growth. If that growth is north of 2.5%, then that's going to trigger statewide compression. So we went from 93, right, to 91.64 to 91.34, and so on and so forth. That much of that compression has been due to a Controller forecast of value growth that's north of 2.5%. Okay. The next bullet point there notes that the legislature has to fund some additional statewide compression if there's districts at that 90% floor. So Zapata, the example we just went through, they went down to the 90% floor. That's a provision in House Bill 3. No district can be sort of compressed down below that level. If a district is at that level, the state essentially saves money in the short term because they're not compressing that district down as much. But the following session, the state has to take that savings and buy down the statewide compression rate. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. Often, or at least with this last session, there were some districts at that 90% floor. And so the state had to appropriate additional dollars to pay for this obligation here for additional statewide compression. And again, you can kind of view this statewide compression number as the maximum MCR, the ceiling for your MCR. No district can have an MCR above the statewide compression amount. Switching over to the local side, this is going to be determined by your local property value growth, that exercise we just went through with Amy on the local property value survey. And as you remember, there are some adjustments for 313 and 311s and local optional homestead. And now you know where to find all those bits of information. Again, with local compression, there's a 2.5% threshold, similar to over on the state side. So if you're growing in excess of 2.5%, that could result in additional compression. Realistically, you gotta outpace the state compression in a lot of cases to have additional compression. But the way the statute's written, it's possible that you could have additional compression if your year-over-year value growth is north of 2.5%. And again, as y'all are aware, this local compression is going to impact each district differently. If you're growing relatively quickly, your values are growing, your MCR may be different than your neighbors, right? Because maybe their property values aren't growing at the same rate yours are. And so here's how this is kind of played out since the passage of House Bill 3. You can see in the first year of House Bill 3, again, prior to House Bill 3, everybody was at $1. House Bill 3 shaved everybody, shaved 7% off everybody's tier 1 rate. Okay, knocked everyone down from $1 to 93 cents. Then in the second year of House Bill 3, the controller estimated statewide property value growth of just over 4%. Once you take that estimate, plug it into the formulas in state law, that reduces the 93% down to 91.64. Okay, so in tax year 20, nobody had a tier 1 rate that was higher than 0.9164. That 91.64% gets applied to your dollar of your pre-House Bill 3 tax rate. Then you can see in tax year 21, the controller estimate was 1.84%. Okay, that's less than the 2.5% that I noted earlier, right? And so if that were the only provision in law, there wouldn't have been any tax compression that year. We had 91.64 in 20. We would have still had 91.64 in 21. However, local compression kicked in tax year 20. And so we had some districts at that 90% floor. They grew really fast, went all the way down to the floor. And as I mentioned earlier, the state kind of has to, if a district's at that floor, that generates essentially a bill to the state. They have to appropriate more money the following session to pay for tax compression. And so those districts at the 90% floor caused the legislature to pay for an additional 0.3% of tax compression. So that's why we didn't get 9164 in 21, we got 9134. Okay, because again of those districts at the bottom floor of the tax compression. For tax year 22, you can see the controller's estimate is 4.36. So that's again higher than 2.5%. We're going to have compression just for the statutory formula. That brought it down to 89.71. But again, the legislature had to pay the 0.3% extra for all those districts down at the floor back in 20. And so that brought it down to 89.41. Okay, so that's sort of the story on how we landed on that number. Okay, so again, the purpose that these serve is this is the cap to your tier 1 rate. Okay, so let's say your district has had flat property value growth all of these years. Okay, you've stayed at the same number or even declined. Your tier 1 rate is going to be forced down by the state. Okay, so even if you're not growing at all, you're still going to see some tax compression as this statewide compression number ticks downward. Okay, so this is sort of the cap, the ceiling on your tier 1 rate part of your M&O tax rate. And then you can see in the first year of House Bill 3, local compression was not active. They, I think, gave the controller's office and TEA time to get their stuff in order and implement that. And it clicked on in the second year of House Bill 3. And again, as I mentioned before, it's generally speaking, if you see growth more than 2.5%, you could be subject to additional rate compression. It's going to kind of depend on exactly where you are, but that's the general rule of thumb. And then, of course, that local compression provision will continue on. It's not set to expire or anything like that. So I'm going to go through just some examples of how this has looked over the years and kind of putting a little bit more context here. And so here you can see the statewide compression rate. Again, this is the cap. And so in tax year 20, that was 9164. And what this chart shows you is this is your tier 1 rate here on the left. And then on the bottom is your year-over-year property value growth. Okay, so for a district growing at 2.5%, they would have still been compressed down from 93 pennies, which it was what it was in 19, down to 91.64. Okay, once you grew by more than 4.01%, again, that was the state estimate. So once you exceeded the state estimate, then you started seeing additional compression, okay? And you kind of slid down here, this diagonal line, and depending on where you were, okay? So if you were at, let's call this 12% year-over-year growth, you may have been at 85 for your tier 1 rate, okay? And then you can see, as I mentioned earlier, this at 90%, it sort of bottomed out here. Okay, so 90% of 9164 is this 8247. And so maybe around 16% growth. If you were at 16% growth year over year or higher, you still got the same tier 1 rate. Okay, so 16% got 8247, 30% got 8247. Okay, so anything north of that threshold, you would have got the same tier 1 compressed rate. Okay, so that was tax year 20. In tax year 21, again, we saw because of those districts at the 90% floor, the statewide compressed rate was down to 91.34. Okay. But the same sort of dynamics are at play for tax year 21. Okay, you had to exceed a certain cutoff in this year because the statewide estimate was so low. Any growth north of 2.8% was going to put you on this local compression path here. Okay, and so then again, as this statewide compressed rate goes down, this floor goes down. Okay. And so 90% of 9134 is now 8220. And so that was the floor for those districts that had a lot of property value growth. They couldn't be compressed down below 8220. Now for this year, we know that the controller has estimated 4.36% value growth. That's brought that compression rate down to 89.71. But again, because of the 90% floor, we're tacking on an additional 0.03. So the cap is going to be 89.41 this year. You cannot have an MCR higher than 89.41. And then because this cap changed, that 90% floor changed. Okay, and so again, same kind of dynamics here. Once you exceed the statewide estimate plus that additional compression amount that was tacked on, once you exceed that around that threshold, then you're going to start seeing some additional local compression, and you're going to bottom out at that 90% floor. Again, 90% of 89.41 is 80.46. Okay, so that's the new floor for tax year 22. And so just to kind of remind you all how this, so again, this is all just the tier 1 portion of your tax rate we're talking about. There's still another tier of your tax rate. And so just kind of going through some examples here real quick to show y'all how this fits in with that other tier to get your total tax rate. Okay, so again, this is just an example. Your mileage may vary here, but with this example, prior to House Bill 3, and again, most every district had a tier 1 rate of $1. Everybody saw a compression of 7% down to 93 cents. Okay. Some districts saw tier 2 compression. We'll talk about that more here in a little bit, but everybody saw this compression down to 93 cents. Then in tax year 20, that's again when the local compression kicked in. Some districts may have been compressed down to 91.64. Some may be compressed further below that. But again, it's going to be based on your statewide value growth or your local property value growth. And the other thing to point out here is that your tier 2 pennies are just going to float down on top of tier 1. So as tier 1 gets compressed, those tier 2 pennies, unless you're doing a TRE or disaster penny, anything like that, those are going to float down on top of your tier 1 rate, and then that'll be reflected in your total M&O tax rate. And just to kind of continue the story here, again, as that tier 1 rate gets compressed, your tier 2 pennies float down on top, and you see that difference in the total tax rate. So one thing that I know a lot of folks in Austin and just across the state are kind of worried about is what are the costs of all of this tax compression? And we sort of run some analysis on that. Just of the tier 1 tax compression, this is essentially costing the state as of tax year 21 around $4.2 billion. And we don't know what the cost is for tax year 22 because you guys haven't gotten your certified values yet for 22 and haven't reported those to the state. But once all the dust settles on the local property value survey, we'll be able to update this slide and show kind of how those costs are continuing to grow, just, you know, based on sort of anecdotal evidence. You know, I've talked to districts across the state and they're seeing record levels of property value growth. So I imagine we're going to see a pretty big increase in the cost of this tier 1 tax compression. So switching gears here a little bit over to tier 2. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it's not going to be super relevant for this year, but I just want to make sure y'all are kind of aware how this works. That way, you know, if you ever hear us talk about what's going on at the Capitol, maybe you'll realize, okay, this is going to start triggering tier 2 compression, or I need to be on the lookout for this. So again, when I say tier 2, I'm referencing the up to 17 pennies above tier 1 that districts can choose to levy. Usually you access these pennies through a TRE. You can access the first 5 of them just by board action. Anything above that requires either a TRE or disaster pennies. We've gone through that a couple of times with y'all at Region 1, and if Romaldo wants to have us back for a tax rate adoption session, we'd be happy to do that. And maybe if we have some time at the end, we can recap that a little bit. But again, just want to make sure we have sort of our vocabulary correct here on this portion of the tax rate. And so you can see within tier 2, it may also hear us refer to it as the enrichment tier. The first 8 pennies are called golden pennies. They're called golden pennies because it has a higher yield. You draw down more state aid, and there's no recapture there for golden pennies. And then the next 9 are copper pennies. And these are called copper because they're less valuable than gold. They have a lower guaranteed yield, and there's recapture on those pennies. The thing to note here when it comes to compression is that the copper pennies are subject or potentially subject to compression if the legislature takes certain actions. Okay, golden pennies, there's no provision in state law to compress golden pennies. Okay, but if the legislature takes certain actions, you could see some copper penny compression. Okay, and I'll go into that more here in a little bit. But there was copper penny compression in the first year of House Bill 3. If you had, let's say, for example, you had gone for a TRE prior to House Bill 3, and you were at full 17 pennies, House Bill 3 knocked you down to 0.1383. And it was because your copper pennies were compressed by almost 65%. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but naturally the question that comes up is where the heck did the legislature get 65% from? And it just has to do with the change in the yield of those copper pennies. Okay, so before House Bill 3, it was $31.95 per penny per watt. Now it's $49.28, and that's half of the golden penny yield. So that sort of ratio is 65%. And so that again is what drove that level of compression for your copper pennies in that first year. They increased the yield. Okay, whenever they increase the yield of those copper pennies, that triggers compression. Okay, and there's really 2 ways that the yield can be increased. If they increase the basic allotment, that would be if they increase it from 6160, that would trigger copper penny compression because these yields are tied to the basic allotment. Also, if they can statutorily increase the yields, they have the option to do that, and so if they do that, that would also again increase. That would generate copper penny compression because then we just do this calculation all over again with 49.28 and then whatever the new copper penny yield was. Okay, and that compression percentage would be applied to your existing copper pennies. And so you can see again, this is the same slide as we had earlier. The legislature has not increased the copper penny yield since the passage of House Bill 3. And so if you had 17 cents before House Bill 3 and you're down at 1383, you haven't done a TRE, you haven't done disaster pennies or anything like that. Those number of tier 2 pennies are just going to float on top of your tier 1 rate and just remain unchanged. Okay, and so they're only going to change again if you have a TRE, you do disaster pennies, or the legislature increases the yield of the copper pennies. Okay, and then that would compress the copper pennies. All right. We'll talk just for a little bit about some additional property tax relief measures that were passed and are relevant this year. We'll start with Prop 1. This was on the May ballot. And this one doesn't actually go into effect until the following tax year, but just want to make sure y'all are aware of this and know that this is coming. And so CADs are probably going to have to probably change their reports a little bit. You'll probably see some different information on the controller property value study to reflect this. But in short, what Prop 1 does is it allows all those over 65 and disabled homeowners to see a benefit of tax compression, okay, to really ensure that they see a benefit of tax compression. Okay, so for those of y'all that aren't aware, over 65 and disabled homeowners, they can have their tax bill frozen at their amount in the year that they were qualified. Okay, so let's say I turned 65 2 years ago. My levy was frozen at $1,000, but my property values keep going up. Okay, my bill is not going to go up. Okay, because my levy amount is frozen. So even though my values are going up, if I wasn't 65, my tax bill would go up along with those values. But because I turned 65 a couple years ago, that's that levy is frozen and it's not going to go up. The problem with the way House Bill 3 set up the tax compression is that for those over 65 and disabled homeowners, their levy again was locked in. They didn't see, as everybody else was enjoying the benefits of tax compression and seeing their lower property tax bills, their tax bill was essentially still frozen at that same amount. So going back to my example, let's say I was frozen at $1,000. And if I wasn't 65, my tax bill would have been $3,000. Okay. With House Bill 3 tax compression, that maybe would have knocked that $3,000 tax bill down to say $2,800. But I'm over 65. My tax bill is at $1,000, and so that change in the tax bill from $3,000 to $2,800, that doesn't impact me. I'm still frozen at $1,000. Okay, so what this does is it proportionally reduces their tax bill down by the amount that they saw that the district has their tax rate compressed. Okay, so again, I'm frozen at $1,000. My district sees tier 1 tax compression. Now my $1,000 frozen levy is going to be proportionately reduced down to $900 or $850, whatever, however much your district has seen tax compression. Okay, so this, long story short, ensures that those over 65 disabled homeowners will see a reduction in their tax bill, and that reduction will be in line with the rate compression that your district has seen. And so you can see here that there are some costs to the state of this proposition, but there is a hold harmless for school districts. Okay, so this is not going to impact y'all's net revenue. Okay, it will impact your tax collections, but through the hold harmless that was included in this, you're on a sort of net revenue basis, you're going to be it's not going to have a net impact. And again, just to reiterate, this is not going to affect until tax year 23. We're all very familiar with Prop 2 now. This was the other statewide proposition that was on the ballot related to property taxes back in May, and this also passed. It increased the resident homestead exemption from 25K to 40K. And that does go into effect this year. Okay, it also includes a hold harmless. However, on the INS side, that hold harmless only covers debt that was issued prior to September 1, 2021. So all of those bonds that were passed in May, those would not be covered under this INS hold harmless. Okay, and so essentially Prop 2 has made those bonds a little bit more expensive to service. Okay, because now your tax base got smaller because of Prop 2, right? You increase that exemption, and you're going to have to levy a slightly higher tax rate to service the same amount of debt. Okay, and so just be aware of sort of that impact of Prop 2. At this point, once you get your certified values, I imagine your CADs will have adjusted for Prop 2, and they've already gone through and updated their homestead exemption. But just be aware that if you're still holding on to a preliminary estimate that you got back in April, right, that may have been sent to you prior to the passage of Prop 2. And so your CAD may not have included the effect of Prop 2 in those April estimates, okay? But they will be included in your July certifieds, okay? And so since we're kind of talking about other measures of property tax relief, I'm going to circle back real quick to the way that 90% floor kind of impacts state appropriations, and kind of one thing we're worried about next session. You can see that this was the 2021 school year, so this would have been tax year 20. There were 72 districts that had been compressed down to that 90% floor. That generated $43 million bill to the state. Okay, so remember that 0.03 additional tax compression I talked about earlier? That was the result of these 72 districts down at the floor. Okay, the legislature had to come back and lower everyone's compression down because of this amount. Since tax year 20, we've seen the number of districts down at this floor just explode. Okay, it was 72, now it's 318. The bill that has been sort of generated for the state for the 88 session has now grown, this is just 1 year, has grown to almost $300 million. Okay, so this is sort of 1 year of the bill that they'll have to pay once they come back in January. Who knows what that will look like in tax year 22. Okay, we've seen so many districts with just sky high value growth that there are going to be a lot of districts down at this floor, and it's almost certainly going to generate something north of $300 million for the 22 tax year. And so you take that amount plus the bill that was generated in tax year 21, and the legislature is going to have to use that savings to lower the statewide compression rate. Okay, so we'll be looking for that next session once they get the budget together and include some of those details. But there's almost certainly going to be more than 0.03 additional amount, statewide compression taken off once they pass that 88, the budget for the 88 session. So this is going to be sort of an additional cost for the state. Fortunately, they're sitting on quite a bit of reserves right now, about $27 billion. So, I'm not worried about them paying this bill in the immediate future, but as this continues and as a sort of downward spiral of tax compression continues, this could be a problem for the state, to maintain sustainably into the future. And so, again, just kind of wanted to go over some of these things at a macro level, and so you guys can kind of understand how your individual compression relates to some of the decisions that are made up at the Capitol. All right, so as folks are filling up their water, stretching their legs, I saw a question come through in the chat. Let's see. It says the increase of the homestead exemption from 25,000 to 40,000 for tax year 22. Are we going to need to reduce our freezes for over 65? Let's see. Jorge, why don't you come off? Let's see if we can unmute you, and you can give us a little bit more context on your question that you sent over to me. Let's see if I can figure this out here. There you go. I should have just sent you a message to unmute, Jorge. There you go.
Hello, hi, good morning.
Hey, how's it going?
Just fine, thanks. Yeah, what I was wondering, I recall something like this happened back in 2015 where the homestead exemption changed. And back then, the freezes needed to be adjusted to, I guess, include the change of the homestead exemption amount. So in this case, the net effect change from 25,000 to 40,000 is 15,000. So what I was wondering is if we get those 15,000 times our tax rate, and we would have to reduce our freezes by whatever amount that ends up being.
Right. So a couple things. One, that would require legislation, and I think it may even require another constitutional proposition, though I'll need to double check that. But it's going to at least require legislation. Okay. And so you're right that they did that last time. Okay. They didn't do it this time. They didn't learn from their mistake, right? So last time they did it, and then they corrected it, I believe, the next year. Maybe they'll correct it next year. I'm not sure, but they didn't make that adjustment with Prop 2. Okay. And so it's not guaranteed then that those frozen values would. They may not see that impact. Okay. So I wouldn't worry about it right now. Yeah. Okay. And again, well, go ahead.
No, sorry. So for now, we wouldn't need to worry about adjusting those. That I guess that portion was not adopted with this change.
Yeah. Right. That's correct. And and it's not, as a school district, it's not something you would do anyway, right? It's something your CAD would help facilitate, and your assessor collector and all that. And so that's sort of something that they would facilitate. But yeah, that was not included in Prop 2.
Oh, okay. And earlier within your presentation, you mentioned something about some change that would happen in 2023 for over 65 accounts.
Yes.
What was that about?
So that was Prop 1, right? There was Prop 2, which increased the homestead exemption. There's Prop 1 on the ballot as well. That just made sure those over 65 and disabled homeowners got a benefit or a reduction in their tax bill that corresponded with the rate compression that was required under House Bill 3. Okay, so as your M&O rate's been compressed, your over 65 and disabled homeowners may not have gotten any relief from that, depending on kind of how long it had been since they turned 65. And the story's going to be different for each individual, but generally speaking, they didn't get any relief due to the House Bill 3 tax compression. And so Prop 1 just passes that House Bill 3 compression onto the over 65 and disabled homeowners, and make sure that that their tax bill is reduced.
Okay, and that's gonna be until 2023. So
That
those pieces-
will, yeah, you'll see that on your certified report next year.
okay. And then next year, then those recesses would need to be adjusted by that compression rate, right? By rate.
Yeah, and it's gonna depend on, so we've had, let's see, we had compression in 19, 20, 21, 22, and then at that point, 23. So 5 years of compression. It will depend on when that individual turns 65, right? If they turn 65 in 23, then they're not going to get the benefit of all of those back years of tax compression, right? But if they turn 65 in 2018 or became disabled in 2018, then they would get the benefit of all those back years of tax compression. So it's going to be a real nightmare for your CADs and your assessor collector to calculate and get all that right. For that reason, I think that's why they delayed implementation a little bit, because the CADs and the controller and school districts, you guys are all going to have to coordinate and communicate information correctly on that. Like, for example, your CADs and assessor collectors are going to need to know what your MCR was in each year, so that way they can properly, reduce the bill for those over 65 and disabled homeowners. And so it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for them.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for the information.
No problem. All right. So we are going to get back going with our regularly scheduled programming here. Next up is how to look at those certified value reports and sort of project what your T values are going to be. We're going to mostly focus on T2, because that's what's going to drive your M&O funding, at least the bulk of it. And then, but I'll go through a little bit on how to convert that to a T8, which is going to be what's used on the INS side, and answer any questions y'all might have on that. So again, the controller values, these are using data elements that your CAD submits to the controller in late August, early September. The controller kind of does a check on these, right? Make sure they're within sort of range of reasonableness. If they are not, the controller can assign state values. I know a number of y'all in Region 1 have kind of been through this before. And so just a caveat with all this stuff that I talk about, this is going to be calculating a T value based on your local CAD data, okay? You don't always get a T value that's based on your local CAD data, right? Again, if it falls outside of that range of reasonableness that the controller sets, and you kind of go through that grace period process and all that, you may get a T value that's based on sort of state estimates of property values in your district, okay? So just keep that in mind, that school districts can't really predict that if they're going to get state values assigned. If you're in a grace period, so you should, if you are in a grace period or you have gotten state values assigned in 21, know that that's a possibility, and talk to your CAD about it and see what they're doing to fix it. But right at this point, we can't really forecast that. Okay, so we're just using the data that's sort of on your certified report from your CAD. And so the controller does a couple of things differently with their T value calculations that your CAD, when compared to your CAD. So the controller doesn't care about, for T2 purposes, does not care about any local optional homestead exemption you may have passed. That doesn't get factored in to your T2, okay? And then they also do a little bit of a different treatment on frozen values. We talked a little bit about this at FAC think back in May, maybe in the April one, but so some of these calculations will look familiar, but I'll kind of go through where exactly on your report you can find them and what information you'll need. Okay, so the sort of shorthand version of the T2 calculation is represented on this slide here. You're going to start with your M&O net taxable, which Amy helpfully directed our attention to that on that main report page. So you guys should now know where that lives. That's essentially the same number you would have used for LPBS purposes. Then you subtract out that frozen value loss, which is a special calculation that the controller does, and we'll go through that here in a little bit. And then if you have a local optional homestead exemption, which again, we went through during the LPBS section, you know where to find that, right, on that exemption breakdown page. And you will need to add that value back in to get a T2, because again, the T2 doesn't recognize or adjust for the local optional homestead, but your CAD does, right? If you do have this exemption, your CAD's going to take the value off the books, but the controller doesn't do that. They add it back in. Okay, so we're going to walk through again where you can find all these things. As we talked about earlier, you want to go to that grand totals net taxable figure. If you have a 313, make sure to use the M&O when you're doing the T2, right? T2 is the state value for that's used for determining M&O state aid. And so you can see that sort of highlighted there. I had to move to a different guinea pig here, so sorry, Zapata, but we need a slightly different set of reports, and I happen to have those from Carrizo Springs. So hopefully y'all will forgive me for going a little bit outside Region 1 here, but I had these reports handy. And you may need to ask your CADs for a separate series of reports that I'll touch on here in a minute. Okay, but this should be pretty straightforward for everybody. Grabbing that M&O net taxable from the grand totals page. Again, if you don't have a 313, you'll just see net taxable listed there, and that'll be the same. You'll use that same number for M&O and INF. Okay, so we got that number plugged in. As you see my little note here, you may want to reduce this if there's any expected losses through the ARB process. Okay, remember, you don't want to adjust this number for LPBS, right? For LPBS, you take the grand total number and you stick it in the LPBS. But remember the timeline that I kind of touched on earlier. You get your July 25th certified, and then late August, early September, your CAD submits that to the controller's office. Okay, so between late July and late August, some of those protests are going to get settled. Okay, and so some of that number could bounce around a little bit. Okay, and so if you want to sort of forecast that change and incorporate that into your T2 estimate, your CAD supplies data to do that. And so you can see that listed on these pages. And so, you know, we talked a lot about those pages that say grand totals, right? There's also a series of reports that say under ARB review. These are the values that are being protested. Okay, so on Carrizo Springs 22 certified totals, they just have one property that's under review. That taxable value for that property is almost $3 million. And then a couple pages down in that same packet, you'll see a table that looks like this. And you can see the CAD provides an estimate of what they think that 2.981 taxable value will get reduced down to. Okay, so in this case, the CAD's thinking sort of worst case scenario, they're gonna, it's gonna get knocked down 60,000 bucks. Okay, so generally speaking, at this point, hopefully your CAD at certification, hopefully your CAD has a lot of these things already settled, right? So this shouldn't be hopefully not a whole lot of protests out there. And so hopefully there's not a big difference between sort of your total taxable value for these under ARB review properties and this lower value used figure here. But if you want to really nerd out on this stuff and try and forecast where we're going to be at the end of the protest and where we're going to be in late August, there are some tools and some resources in that packet that you get from your CAD. Okay, and so if those numbers are, if that difference is bigger, maybe go ahead and maybe adjust this 8.2 number, you adjust that net taxable number by the difference. Okay, so in this example, it's a $60,000 difference. If I wanted to, I could reduce this number by $60,000. Okay, it's not going to make a big difference if your tax base is 8.2 billion, but if there's more gap between those two, then maybe you want to make an adjustment, or at least call your CAD and say, hey, I'm seeing really big differences between the sort of initial taxable value that you used for the protested properties and what shows up on this lower value used tab. Okay, and so again, just another little way you can refine that estimate and just review, just kind of better understand what values are under protest and sort of what your CAD, where your CAD thinks that those may land. Okay, so you can see I didn't make an adjustment to this number because it's only $60,000, but again, feel free to do that if your situation is different. But I got my net taxable figure in here. I feel good about that. Next up is the frozen value loss. Okay, and this is probably the most mind-numbing part of the presentation. So stay with me, take a sip of coffee, we'll get through it together. You can find all this information on the frozen table here. And that's again, we're on the certified total page, we're on the grand total section, and we're looking at this freeze table down at the bottom. Okay, so you'll need these totals here, both for taxable, okay, not assessed, you don't need that. You need it for taxable and you need it for actual tax. You need these two numbers. You see a tax rate here. You can ignore that because this tax rate is essentially last year's tax rate. Okay, your CAD doesn't know your 22 tax rate because you haven't adopted it yet, right? You're going to adopt it in late August or in September, hopefully. And so this is not the tax rate we're going to use. Okay, but you will need, again, this total taxable for your over 65 and disabled properties. And then the actual tax is what they actually pay. Okay, so this is the value of their homes. This is what they are actually expected to pay in the current tax year. Okay, then this is why I had to ditch Zapata as the guinea pig here and move over to Carrizo Springs, because Zapata, I didn't have your freeze totals report. Okay, if you want to do this calculation, you need to ask your CAD. You can see on all these other reports, it says certified totals at the top. We need a series of reports called freeze totals. And all this is the certified total reports are all the property in your district. Okay, freeze total reports are just the subset of those properties that are over 65 and disabled. Okay, so it's really just all of these properties, and it's a detail on the over 65 and disabled. Okay, What we need is on the exemption breakdown page, they have listed here those local exemptions. Okay, and again, so these are local exemptions just on frozen properties. Okay, so that's the subset here that we're looking at, frozen properties, the local exemptions that are given to those. Okay, and for calculating this freeze loss, the way the controller does it, we need homestead, over 65 spouse, that's what that S stands for, and then disabled. Okay, so they have a 0 here. So we'll need essentially 4 numbers, but really for these guys, we just need these 3 here because that one's a 0. Okay. So then we go through and I've sort of identified the steps you'll need here. We take the taxable value, right? 13.6, I pulled from here, right? 13.6. Then I entered in their projected total tax rate for 22-23. Okay, so you can see for Carrizo Springs, it was 91.64. That's M&O and INS. It just happened to be 91.64. And you can see that's different than the tax rate that's here. This is essentially, again, the 21 tax rate. We don't want that. Your CAD just puts it in there because that's all they have. Okay, so we don't want to use that. We want to use, again, whatever tax rate you're projecting for the current year. Okay, so do your tax compression work first. Fill out that template, fill out the local property value survey so you know what your M&O rate is going to be, figure out where you want your INS rate to be, plug that in here. Okay, whoops. So we got that plugged in. Then you plug in your actual levy, which again, I got from right here. It's called actual tax on here. Okay, I plugged in that number. Okay, then I'm gonna skip down to line 8 here. This is the local disability or disability spouse and the local homestead exemption. So DP, DPS, or HS, those are the codes you'll look for. So 0 for DP, no DPS, and HS right here. Okay, so I plug in that 10 million right there, 10.2. Then I plug in my local over 65 exemption, which is listed as over 65 right here, the 6.478. And then I plug in my over 65 exemption spouse over 65S, 65,000, which I got from right there. Okay, so again, these are going to be on the freeze total reports. Some CADs give them to you without, you don't have to ask for it. I've noticed Hidalgo, Cameron, and at least Zapata, they don't automatically give them to you, but it's very easy for them to run. It's part of the software that they use for this. And so I would just ask them if it shouldn't be any problem to get you those reports. And so you can see I kind of went a little bit out of order. I set up this slide to look like the way your CADs actually fill out this information. So apologize for the kind of scattered ordered here, but I'm gonna walk through again this calculation. So you start with this taxable value number that you pull straight off the certified total report. Then you can see line 2 here is just the sum of line 1 and line 11, which is all of those local values that we pulled earlier. Okay, so adding those two together gets you this 30.3 million. Then we use your tax rate, your total tax rate, to calculate a levy. Okay, so this is essentially what your over 65 and disabled homeowners would have paid if they weren't over 65 or disabled. They weren't subject to these exemptions, and they didn't have their levy frozen. Okay, so that is what they would have paid. Then we compare that to what they actually paid, right, or what they're expected to pay, what their actual tax bill is. Okay, that's that 88,000 we pulled from here, from actual tax. Okay. That difference for this district is 190,000. What the controller does is it then looks at this difference and says, okay, how much property value would be needed to generate that level of collections? Okay, so they look at your tax rate, and you can kind of see the math here. It's line 6 divided by 3 divided by 100. Make sure you get those parentheses right. Remember back to PEMDAS back in elementary school. So don't want to make that mistake. And then that's going to get you your total value loss. Okay, this is essentially going to correspond. This red number here is what ultimately shows up on the controller property value study. Okay, so this is a snapshot of this report for tax year 20. Okay, we won't get a 22 controller property value study until January of 23. And just so y'all know, I know, again, Romualdo said there were some new CFOs on the call. I'm just going to show y'all real quick where you can find this. So I just Googled controller PVS. It was the first thing that popped up. You can go down here, school district PVS findings. Okay. You can see we have just the preliminary 21 that's out right now. Final won't come out until August. Okay. So we're going to just look at preliminary. And then you find your county. My guinea pig district here is in Dimmitt County. And then all of those frozen details are on the deduction detail tab. Okay, so that's where you can find that information. So you can see back in 21, all of these calculations for this district yielded a number that was close to 27.8 million. And again, just to, as I know here, just to prove that all this hocus pocus actually works, I went back and got some screenshots of this district's certified value reports back from 21. And so I'm just gonna, I'm pulling again these taxable numbers, this actual tax. I'm pulling these local deductions, these local exemptions here. I'm gonna bring all this into this same kind of methodology that I had here, and you can see I get a number that's 27.8 million. Okay, and so that's a little bit different. I think on the other screen is 27.79. This is 27.816. So it's a little different. The differences are mostly going to be due to that change. Remember that from the July certified to the end of August, some of these values can bounce around a little bit. Okay, so maybe some of these things were under protest or something else was going on. And so that's going to be explaining why this isn't exactly what we saw on the controller report. But you can see we get really, really close. Okay, and so that's going to be, this is going to outline the way you can take these elements, again, from the certified total report, these two numbers, and from the freeze total report, those 4 exemptions, again, homestead, over 65 spouse, and disabled, and you may have a disabled spouse property there as well, so that would be DPS. You would need to pull that as well. And again, all of those are listed here: DP, DPS, HS, over 65 spouse. And so plug all those in. Again, I apologize for kind of the circuitous way this is set up, but again, I kind of wanted to match the schedule that the controller put together. So that is essentially the nuts and bolts of how to do a freeze loss exemption. Again, just to reiterate, you really need to get those freeze totals reports and make sure you get, if you offer any of those local exemptions, that you plug those in, because if you don't, you get a very different number here. Okay, so here's an example. I forgot to get my CAD reports here. I have zeros. And if I run through that same calculation I just did, instead of getting 27.8, which again is pretty close to what it actually ended up being on the property value study, I get 8.4, right? So I'm way off, okay? And so that's why those freeze total reports, the information that goes here is going to be really key to getting you a correct total value loss figure there. Okay, so we got our M&O net taxable, we're good there. We got our freeze value loss plugged in with that very torturous calculation. But we're past it now. We got that plugged in. We're good to go. And then really for T2 purposes, the only the last sort of remaining big item is the local optional homestead exemption. Okay, and we touched on that, whoops, a little bit earlier on the local property value survey section. Again, you want to go to grand totals, exemption breakdown page, look for the homestead row and the local column. This is the number that reflects the loss from your local optional homestead exemption. Okay, and so once you find that number, and again, this is what you would have entered into the local property value survey for tax year 22. All right, so this, you should already have found this number and you just go grab it again, plug it in here. So we're doing 8.2 minus 20.7 million plus the, this is the freeze loss plus the 26.5 million in local optional homestead exemption. And voila, we have a T2 value, okay? And again, just to reiterate, this is based on local values. And so all those same caveats about state values assigned and how that may change this number, that applies. So just be mindful of that. As I note here, you can make adjustments for A or B losses. I kind of talked about that already, where you can see kind of what your CAD is estimating what those losses will be, right, on those two sections of the report. So you can make those further refinements. There's a couple other things that are like the frozen value loss. One of them is deferrals. And you can see that going back to this example. So here's our frozen values that we just went through. If you scroll down a little bit, all of these other variables are on the CAD report already, right? The state mandated homestead exemption, we know that's on there. The state mandated over 65 or disabled, all these other things are on there. So except for this freeze loss, that's why we had to do that calculation. But all these other things are on here. And then one thing that's not is this deferred taxes. That's something that, again, if you wanted to, you'd have to make another request of your assessor collector or your CAD to get a report and do a calculation to yield this number that the controller does. Generally speaking, I don't I kind of don't advise districts to worry about that, because again, in this particular example, it was not even $1 million, and their total tax base was almost 6 billion. Okay, so it's not going to make a huge difference. It's not worth getting those reports from your CAD. But if you, again, really want to get down into the nitty gritty on that, I'm happy to do that, but I'm going to assume that most of y'all don't care. And so I can walk some of those that want to take property tax, the advanced class. They can give me a call and we can walk through that. But this would be one thing that's not that we haven't adjusted for. Okay, but it's small again, and I wouldn't really worry about it. The other thing that we haven't adjusted for is if you have a TIF, tax increment financing. This is a sort of special limitation that's allowed in statute. If you had it, it would show up on, let me go back here. It would show up on this exemption report, or actually you would, I'm sorry, you would get a separate report from your CAD about your TIF. And so it's just one of those things that you kind of just have to know if you got it or not. I don't think I've heard of a TIF with any Region 1 district, but some of y'all may have them. If you're not sure and you think you may have it, shoot me an email and we can talk about that more. But that would be one other thing that, again, we didn't adjust for in this sort of shorthand calculation. This is going to cover 90% of districts out there. Okay, just getting these three numbers right and putting them together. That's going to for 90% of districts, that's going to be good enough for your T2 estimate. Okay. Then, of course, as we noted just with the local property value survey, if you're a split district, if you're across multiple counties, you're going to need to do this fun exercise a couple times, or for however many counties you are split across. You're going to need to go get all those CAD reports and do the same kind of analysis and add those together. And then, of course, as I mentioned, this only projects your T2 based on local values. If you get state values assigned, right, if the controller looks at those CAD reports and says, these are outside the range of reasonableness, we don't agree with these values, we're gonna put together our own values for you, then all this T2 work we just did based on local values, that's going to be thrown out the window, okay, because the state's going to come in and override that. So just be aware that that could be a reason why your T2 estimate is not accurate once the PVS comes out. Okay. I saw some questions. I don't think they were directed at us, but I'm going to pause. If you guys do have questions about that, go ahead and enter them in. And then we just got one last little section here. I think we're going to end quite a bit early. Yeah, thanks for sticking around so far. We're going to talk about tax collections next. Let's see. Yeah, you will need to, thanks Jaime for getting Region 1 on that. You will need to make a request of your county to get those freeze reports. So I'll give you guys just another minute to get some questions in. I'm gonna try and stop clearing my throat here. All right. I guess we just did such a good job explaining that y'all don't have any questions. All right, I'll take that. So for our last little section, we're going to talk about tax collections. Again, I saved the easiest one for last because I think most CFOs do a pretty good job of this on their own. You guys kind of understand how values relate to collections, but we'll just go through it again to make sure we're all on the same page. So you remember for the first two items, for state aid and for tax compression, we used net taxable number. Okay, that is with all of your over 65 and disabled homes included in that. For tax collections, we're going to use a slightly different number. We're going to start with your freeze adjusted value, which is still on that same report. But freeze adjusted just means all of those over 65 and disabled properties, all of that value for those properties has been removed from the total. Okay. And we're doing that because they're not taxed based on their value, right? Over 65 and disabled folks, they're taxed based on their frozen levy. Okay. So we got to treat them a little bit differently. And then we may want to incorporate some ARB losses and collection rates and all that kind of stuff to get to a good collection projection. So let's get started on that. So for the M&O levy, here is sort of conceptually how we approach it at MoKC. First, we start with the levy. The levy is the first sort of row here is going to be all of the collections that are on your non-frozen properties. Okay, so we get your M&O, freeze adjusted taxable value from your CAD report, divide by 100 times the M&O rate that you think you're going to adopt for the current year. Again, you'll probably want to figure out what your compressed rate is going to be, how many tier 2 pennies you're going to levy, and what your INS, I'm sorry, we'll just do tier 1 and your tier 2 rate, because we're just doing M&O for now. And so this is, again, the collection for all of your non-frozen properties. Then we add in your frozen properties. So that's that actual tax figure we went and pulled earlier. We take that total, and then we portion that total out by how much of your tax rate is M&O. Okay, so let's say 90% of your tax rate is M&O. That means of all the taxes your over 65 and disabled homeowners pay, 90% of that we're going to call M&O, 10% of that we're going to call INS. Okay, that's generally how that gets distributed. Okay, again, if you have a 313, make sure to get the M&O value for M&O collections and the INS value for INS collections, because 313s cause a difference between the M&O and INS values. Then just to get from levy to collections, we just need really 2 other bits of information. We now have our levy. You need to think about what your current year collection rate is. Okay, and you can review your J1 for that. Go look at some historical trends, go look at maybe the past 3-4 years, what your current year collection rate. So this is of your levy, your current year levy, how much do you collect in that current year? Okay, that's the percentage that we need to punch in there. Okay, so that would be our collection rate. And then we add in whatever estimate we have for delinquent tax collections. And again, the delinquent taxes are kind of hard to predict because it just kind of depends on the specifics of that taxpayer when they finally get around to paying a tax bill. And so, you know, maybe look back a couple years, see if there's a trend. You know, maybe try and pick a number that's kind of on the low side of that trend, so that way you can be conservative with your collection projection. But that would be included in that M&O. That's a number that we need to sort of include in our projection of M&O collection. So kind of going through this, we're back to Zapata now. We are again looking at their grand totals page. Their M&O net taxable is right here. So we got that number plugged in, divide by 100, multiply by their tax rate. And again, this is their projected tax rate. We saw back on Amy's section that we think Zapata is going to be compressed all the way down for tier 1 to 8046. And then they have 5 golden pennies. I'm assuming they're not doing a TRE. Zapata, if you're on chat, send something in the chat and let me know. So we're just tacking on the 5 golden pennies. And so that's a total M&O rate of 8546 for them. And so that is how we calculate their collections for all the non-frozen properties. And then for the frozens, we take, again, that actual tax number for frozens, which you can kind of see real small off to the side here, plug that in, and then multiply by whatever percentage of their tax rate is M&O. Okay, so I got their total M&O tax rate here as a denominator. All right, great. She confirmed only 5 pennies there. We got the M&O rate as as a numerator, and then their total tax rate, I believe their INS rate was, would just be the difference between those two. And so this is their total tax rate. And so whatever that percentage is, that gets applied to the 164. And so that portion of the frozen taxes gets attributed to M&O. Okay. Then it's kind of the same story there with INS, except we just want to take the INS net taxable number. Again, this is only going to apply if you have a 313. If you don't have a 313, you're just going to see something that says freeze adjusted taxable. Okay. And then you'll just have one number here. That's going to be the same for M&O and INS. And I think that is actually about it. I'm happy to stick around for other questions. If you guys want to have questions about property tax or about tax rate adoption, or you're thinking about doing disaster pennies or going for a TRE or anything like that, feel free to leave some questions in the chat, and we can bring you off mute and have a conversation that might be useful for some other folks on the call. And so yeah, let's hear from y'all if you guys have any questions right now.
Questions, anyone? I guess we're in a mental freeze.
Yeah.
Too much information.
Yeah. A couple other things, just timeline things that sort of keep in mind. Generally speaking, we advise folks to adopt their tax rate in September. I know some folks want to do it in August, and it's probably okay, but your MCR doesn't technically become finalized until the end of August, as Amy mentioned earlier. And so for that reason, just to be on the safe side, we would sort of advise folks to adopt their tax rate at some point in September. You have until essentially the end of September to adopt your tax rate statutorily. So you got plenty of time to do that. You can, if you're a September 1 district, you can adopt your budget. You'll adopt your budget in August, and you can just adopt your tax rate later on once that MCR becomes finalized. The only times we would recommend you adopting your tax rate before September is if you are having a TRE. TREs require that you adopt your tax rate 78 days before the election. So for a November election, that puts that in late August. And so that would really be the only time we recommend you adopting it in August. For those folks with local optional homestead exemptions, or you're thinking about changing your local optional homestead exemption, that deadline is July 1st. So that's already been locked in for tax year 22, but you could change that. You can revisit your local optional homestead exemption each year. You just have to have your board make that decision before July. Yeah, Jaime is kind of calling me out here a little bit in front of everybody. Thank you, Jaime. If you remember, if you've been on some of our webinars last year, we had a little calculator and to calculate your T2. Essentially what we did, our approach then was we just held the freeze loss constant from one year to the next and just rolled it over. Because of Prop 2 and some of the other changes with the freeze values that are coming up, we've kind of changed our tune on that a little bit, and it's kind of a mind-bending calculation, but we think it's best for y'all to know how that actually works when you're projecting your T2, and not just roll over the same number from the previous year. So that's what we did last year on that calculator. So now we're kind of we're having y'all focus on that a little bit more because of Prop 2 and other stuff, but hopefully simplifying it in other ways. I know we're mixing it up on y'all, and I appreciate y'all's patience and willingness to learn. Yeah, no worries on that.
Questions, anyone, comments? So Josh, during your presentation, you mentioned that we would invite you for tax rate adoption. So can you share with the group, what would that entail? What are we expecting from that session?
Yeah, so what that would be is we could start, it'd probably take us about this length of time, hour and a half, I'd imagine, to go through all of the truth and taxation requirements, right? Go through, and for a lot of y'all, I know you guys get the county to help you with that. But some districts don't get that. And so it may be more useful for those that don't get support from the county on that. But you have to you have to fill out the controller worksheets. You have to calculate your no new revenue rate, your voter approval tax rate. You have to append that worksheet to your budget. You have to make sure you're getting the right verbiage for your tax resolution. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat here. If depending on what your depending on how your tax rate, what tax rate you're adopting, that can kind of impact the verbiage that you have to use for your resolution and for the motion to adopt your tax rate. So we can kind of go through those kind of nitty gritty items and that kind of thing. Just all those sort of procedural steps to adopt your tax rate accurately. And then also there's some considerations with the threshold that your board approves. For certain tax rates, you have to have passage by a certain amount of board members, and that can kind of depend on what your tax rate is, and then some other items. And so we just had, I think Round Rock got in trouble just this past year for not having enough board members approve the tax rate, and that they got some taxpayer advocacy group kind of took them to court over that, and it was a big headache for them. And so knowing those kinds of things, that way, if you have a board member step out, right, during a board meeting when you're adopting a tax rate, okay, wait, we got to wait until they get back in so we can get that certain threshold met. Those kinds of things, just all the nitty gritty on tax rate adoption.
Josh, and so the timeline for that, we would be looking at sometime late in August or mid-August.
I would say that would be when that information would be the most applicable to y'all. Yeah. Okay. And again, as I mentioned, I would advise y'all to wait until at some point in September to adopt your tax rate. And so I would say, yeah, mid to late August would be a good time to do a refresher on those.
Okay, so I guess we will work on a date. I guess if school districts in attendance can put in here a suggestion for days, and also so that we can check with Josh and Amy to look at their availability. I can tell you that I would see that other session very, very valuable, because being at the school district and trying to guess whether or not you have the right terminology can make a difference with voters and when you bring items for the board to approve. So if you can start populating the chat with dates that may work so that we can check with Josh and Amy so that we can schedule another special meeting to bring this information to you. Now, Josh, I guess for the benefit of the group, will there be a cost associated with that? With that other session, just asking.
Oh, no, we can rope that into the
Asking for a
region.
friend, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Now, if you want us to do it for you, for your individual district, then we have like a turnkey solution where we can go in and do all these calculations and do all of the truth and taxation stuff. That would come with a fee, with an extra fee, but just kind of going through with the group, that would be included with the region 2 or the region 1 services. Sorry.
Okay.
I did want to just share, I guess, if we are going to do that session, one bit of homework for y'all just to kind of read up on. TASB puts out this really good guide on tax rate adoption, and it covers sort of all the nitty gritty. This is really going to be probably 95% of what we would cover in this kind of session. And it goes through all the dates, when you got to get your notice in, the forms you got to fill out on the controller's site. And I just put the link to that in the chat. Each summer, I print this out, and this is my Bible for the summer. I look, I'm constantly referring to this document to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything. And that I'm sort of getting all of the checking all the boxes for our clients. And so this is a really useful document for us at Mokasey. And if you guys haven't seen it yet, I would definitely print this out each year and have it handy when you're going through your tax rate adoption process. Sandra, you asked, can we still use the property value calculator from last year? And yes, it'll still work. The only thing I would recommend is just instead of just rolling over the frozen value loss, sort of in the instructions in that calculator, I recommended just to say, hey, roll it over and you can update it later. I would just say now that you kind of know how to calculate the frozen value loss, like what we just went through, I would say just update that number for 22, put in a better estimate for your freeze value loss instead of just rolling over the number from last year. And that's going to be important because there is kind of some interaction between those two things. And so you'll need to sort of, I think it'd be more appropriate to go through the process and calculate it this year. So that's kind of why we're advising y'all that way. But yeah, generally speaking, all the same stuff is going to work.